Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. every Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'll be speaking with Xavier Barraza, a young man who is involved in a myriad of New Mexico and national movements and advocacy at the intersection of environmental, social, racial, and economic justice. So it should be a very interesting discussion. We'll get to Xavier in just a moment, but first, a few brief announcements. Last week, the plague struck our home, or rather a particularly nasty version of bronchitis. And so we were unable to produce a new show and ran a year-old but very germane interview with Dan Pritchard, one of the founders of Renewable Taos. The week prior, I interviewed Charla Parsons, Democratic Party progressive, and one of the founders of the Adelante Caucus. She is putting her real estate knowledge and relationships together and focusing on housing development, on innovative and focusing on innovative approaches to infill instead of developing more sprawling suburbs. No doubt we have a huge need for new affordable housing throughout New Mexico. As usual, Charlotte challenges traditional thinking and has her strong people skills to facilitate a coalition of housing stakeholders in Albuquerque who just may have a model that the state should consider. I want to remind you that if you're listening to this show while driving around town and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview, including the interview with Charla on housing and Dan on energy and the environment, by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the lower right side of the homepage. You'll find recordings of all our previous shows listed in chronological order, so you can binge watch Retake radio shows for free. How fun. The session is in high gear, so we've resurrected our weekly huddles, with the next being this coming Wednesday at 6 p.m. They're every Wednesday at 6 p.m. In the huddles, we discuss developments in the legislative process for the year, as well as discuss progress of the bills we're supporting. And usually we have someone from one of the bills, a legislator or an ally, who also weighs in. The huddles are also a great way to connect with other advocates. This week, in addition to the 2023 session, we will discuss the governor's broadly criticized nominees for the PRC. We will also discuss what is emerging as a full court effort to pass hydrogen legislation in 2023. So join us, learn more about how the legislature works and how you can lobby effectively. You must register to attend. To get more information and to a link to register, go to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on Actions and Events in the homepage banner. You'll find a link near the top of the page. While on our Actions and Events page, near the top of that page, you'll also find information about our last Zoominar of the session. It's a panel discussion of the Green Amendment, what it is and what it isn't. Our panel includes Maya Van Rossum, founder of the Green Amendment for the Generations, who has led the effort to pass green amendments in New Mexico, in New York, Florida, Pennsylvania, and now New Mexico. Joining her on the panel will be the bill sponsor, Senator Antoinette Cedillo Lopez, and two attorneys, one from New York and one from Pennsylvania. And they will share their experience of what it has been like in those states with the Green Amendment in place for over a year. This is going to be very important because there's a lot of misinformation out there about a plethora of frivolous lawsuits and so forth would be coming from this. And that's just not the way that the Green Amendment plays out at all. So join us and learn more about how the Green Amendment could be an invaluable tool in holding our state accountable for protecting our environment, and find out how you can help pass the Green Amendment in New Mexico. Before we get started, I also want to acknowledge that we're conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We can learn much from their custodial caring for the land, water, and air, and we better learn it soon. Okay, let's meet today's guest, Xavier Barraza. Welcome to the show, Xavier. Let's get started.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I always like to let my guests introduce themselves. So can you tell us how you got involved with environmental and social justice advocacy in New Mexico?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Well, Xavier Barraza is my name. I got involved. Um, I feel like in many respects, it's part of just existing, is affirming who we are and how we wish to live and the families we come from, the cultures we come from, where we got here. So I think it's in all of us, and it's something we all participate in all the time, whether we're conscious of it or not. Um, and I particularly got involved because I was recruited by people who were in my community, reaching out to young people. I was a young person, about 14, and they were interested in connecting me to my history and to myself. And so that's how I got involved. I was recruited by organizers.
What was the organization that recruited you?
I was recruited by a gentleman by the name of Carlos Flores. I mean, this is one of the first engagements, but Carlos, I would say, was a big role in calling me in, and he was doing work with young men in the South Valley where I grew up.
Okay, that's interesting. So I spent a bit of time reading about the various coalitions, organizations, and movements in which you are involved, so I hardly know where to begin. So maybe let's start with how we met. You testified at the Legislative Financial um, Committee, Legislative Finance Committee, a week or so ago. What brought you to oppose the hydrogen production and come to the LFC to testify and share with our listeners the gist of what you said?
Yeah, we had just met earlier that day, thinking about grassroots strategy, frontline strategy, and really I got there because of Chicana and indigenous women who are leading on the front line, and we're organizing to get up there. And I came along. I came along with Dr. Sofia Martinez, or Los Sardines in particular, but we were there with other organizers, all grassroots, indigenous, well, women organizers, femme organizers who were going up to testify, and I was blessed to be in that space and to be called to go along. But we've been working on the issues for a long time.
Okay. And what was it that you said?
Well, I guess I commented on the metaphor that we um, were kind of affirming a metaphor of New Mexico being a spear in the securing of hydrogen and hydrogen energy in the Southwest, and for us to be at the vanguard of establishing that, and that being the tip of a spear is strategic for us as a state. And what I did was comment on the tip of the spear is the first part of the spear to be sacrificed for the kill. And unfortunately, if we are going to be the spear of hydrogen, we're going to be the tip of the spear. That means we sacrifice ourselves as New Mexico and New Mexicans. And what we're throwing the spear at is our planet and ourselves. And so I think that's the kind of gist of what we were commenting on in regard to that um, hydrogen legislation that we were discussing.
Yeah, I just loved it when you said that because they keep using that tip of the spear and metaphor as if it's like, oh, we're going to be great. It's going to be great. New Mexico's going to be recognized, and it's just going to be New Mexico's going to be the first state to like lose hundreds of millions of dollars on a failed technology. So you were involved in the development of de Oro, Environmental and Economic Justice Strategic Plan. Just so our listeners are up to speed, please tell us about de Oro and then about the strategic plan that was developed and how it weaves together environmental and economic justice.
Yes, well, I first want to say there's so many people who need to tell their story for this story to be known. I wasn't part of the original development of the strategic plan. That happened before I got involved. But basically, in short, because I think there's others who have a more accurate understanding of it, is that the community came together, and that community of Mountain View in particular in the south side of Albuquerque or Bernalillo County is a community that has suffered the burden of industrial development. It's the primary organs, industrial organs for the city of Albuquerque, Bernalillo County in our area. And Valle de Oro is one of many efforts of the community to really secure health and wealth for themselves and for future generations by being able to secure land that's going towards restoration of the land and of the people, because that area is so saturated with industrial development. And the strategic plan is significant because a public land site doesn't generally come with a strategy on how to address, critique, interrogate, research, investigate environmental or social harm. It has a mission and an objective, and it doesn't always, that mission and objective doesn't always include our health and our wealth in the ways that other cultures see it. And so there's, anyway, point being, that plan was developed by the community of Mountain View with other stakeholders, the Pueblo of Isleta, who are the sovereign neighbors to our north, and we're on their and the refuge is on their ancestral lands. And so it's an effort of really doing bottom-up natural and cultural resource management. And it's possible because of the community leadership, along with the field leadership, really the people on the ground there at the refuge, who are honoring the research and the science that says we need to really build bottom up and invest in community leadership to do this the right way. And so that's what that's doing, and it's very significant. And there's a lot of people to talk to around that.
By any chance, are Mark Rudd or Marla Painter part of that?
They're definitely part of the community there in Mountain View. They're part of Mountain View Community Action. They're one of the organizations. There's many other folks, Lauro Silva, Magdalena Avila, Sophia and Richard from Los Jardines Institute help with the Environmental and Economic Justice Strategic Plan. David Barber. I mean, we could go on with names. There's a sustainability garden in Mountain View, which is really central and I think a core model and should be lifted up just as Valle de Oro is, which is the Mountain View Community's Sustainable Community Garden, or a community garden and sustainability project. And they're really building their own local food systems and social networking systems in Mountain View around land and around food. And so I would say that's just as significant of a project happening there in the community.
Well, when the legislative session is over, Roxanne and I would love it if we could get a tour, and maybe you could help us with that.
Absolutely. And what we encourage, last thing I'll say, I'm not here on behalf of the VDO and the EJ leadership team today, but we always represent each other, right? And we're always representing our teams. But what I would say is that we encourage everyone to, yes, learn about what we're doing, but to remember that we need environmental and economic justice, social justice at the center of all of our public land sites. And the best place to do that is at the public land site closest to you. Go to your open spaces, go to your public lands, federal, that includes fish and wildlife, right? Refuges, national parks, our bosque, our rivers, and learn how to get involved and protect and really be engaged in that decision making. And so I think that's the real call to action of Valle de Oro, is to make sure we're aware of what's happening, because public land sites are an instrument of colonization and of harm historically. And so that's really the mission, right, is to right historical harms. And that includes long-term looking at collaborative management back with ancestral stewards, or even land back, water back, right? These are other things that we have to consider. And those are decisions we should be advocating for. And if not advocating for that decision, at least advocating for a true meaningful dialogue about those matters, because we need to discuss that. And we should be part of that, each of us.
Sounds like this could be an excellent model for others to kind of learn from.
Absolutely. And we don't have a silver, like a silver ticket. But what we do have is a story, and that story hopefully will connect us to each of our own stories and our relationship to the land around us, and that we are the land and the land we're on. and belong to.
So I see you're also employed at the Environmental and Economic, you are the Environmental and Economic Justice Coordinator at Les Jardins Institute, which looks like it weaves together farming and food distribution with community organizing, presumably around food, food scarcity, and food systems. Can you first tell us a bit about Les Jardins Institute and then about your approach to organizing there?
Yes, and it's Los Jardines Institute, the Gardens Institute. And thank you so much for asking about it. It's a legacy environmental and it's a legacy justice organization. It's grounded with an intergenerational legacy of people who have been historically involved in the movement and in movements across all of our cultures and our intersectional movements. And so Los Jardines Institute is located in the South Valley. And it's also an urban farm, and we have some amazing farmers there who can say much more than I can around what's happening there and the regeneration and the healing of the land and of ourselves. I'm very thankful that I get fed so well and have access to, being part of a community that grows its own food, or at least some of it. And so, yeah, Los Jardines Institute does a lot. They've been around for a long time, at least in different iterations. And it connects back to the history of the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice, even goes back to SWAP, goes back to the Chicano movement in particular here in our communities, here in the South Valley, and the Black and Brown Berets, and also newspapers, just a lot of the things that different communities were doing and all of our peoples were doing. And so that's the story of LJI. And I think Sophia and Richard, who are the co-coordinators, would be able to better share some of the stories that are connected to the Institute.
Well, we'll see if we can get them on the show.
Absolutely.
I noted that your Les Jardins
Los Jardines.
Huh?
Los Jardines.
I'm sorry, Los Jardines.
Yeah.
Organizing had a component that focused on men and boys. Can you tell us about this work? Why the focus on men and boys?
Yeah, no, that was part of my bio on the website about some of my past work. I think absolutely Los Jardines takes a intergenerational, multi-generational family community approach. So that isn't some work we particularly do at Los Jardines. But the work I've done as a young man and as a man now is working with other men the best I can, and for us to just have conversations we don't normally have around what it means, masculinities, femininity, and really diving into that, because that's part of our psyche. It's part of the way we feel. It's part of the way we think. It's part of the way we make decisions. It's part of the way we value the world or value ourselves. And so those are very critical foundations to strong political, social, economic, ecological decision making, is understanding the balance of those energies. And so I think that I was doing work with Together for Brothers for a long time. It's an organization that was founded by young men of color and older men, and our brothers and our sisters and our mamas and all the people in our community who really wanted to gather around supporting young men in our community, because that is something that wasn't really being done for us in the way we needed it done. And so we did that, and it's still around. It's called Together for Brothers. That organization still does amazing work, and we work closely together, and those brothers are still doing amazing work. Fare Free Transit is a major accomplishment that Together for Brothers was a part of, along with a lot of other community members. And yeah, it's amazing work, and it's great to meet men from all over the world, because that's a big part of our focus too. As we at one point spoke 9 different languages in our circles, because we had young men from all across Albuquerque who are from all over the world, the Congo, from Turkey, from Afghanistan, from Mexico, from India, all over the world. And we got to share culture in a real respectful way, in a real meaningful way, and learn, really have a respect for how big the world is and how diverse it is and what makes it beautiful. So that was one of the best things about being as a brother and with the brothers and everyone was meeting people from all over. And
I
what
think
brother,
that's so commendable because I mean, Roxanne and I talk all the time about how, and I even wrote a blog once about how the biggest problem we have is men. We should just hand the baton over to women and take a step back because the testosterone levels in men drive some pretty bad decision making and so forth, and machismo and so forth. So it's good to have these opportunities for men to get together and talk about that.
yeah, no, it's a really important thing, and definitely a core central aspect of why we have the systems we have and why we're having these conversations and addressing these issues.
Okay, sorry, I got to take a short break here to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever right now in this time of misinformation in the mainstream media and social media. KSFR offers timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you informed and sane. And they also offer wonderful music and cultural programming and programs like Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, the BBC, and the KSFR's own state and local news, so you can be kept informed with real information. And then nowhere else are you going to get an hour of socialist radio. And on Saturday mornings at 8 o'clock, you get Richard Wolf on KSFR with Economic Update. And if you haven't listened to him, you really have to start your Saturdays with that and then just stick around for us. So you get a full hour of socialist radio. And if you appreciate that kind of programming, I encourage you, when you get done listening to the show, go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button and toss them 10, 20, 50 bucks, whatever you can afford, and view it as your ticket for admission to some excellent programming. And on behalf of KSFR, I want to thank you. So let's get back to our discussion with Xavier. So Xavier, another initiative in which you are involved in is the Justice 40 grassroots organizing. I think that this is connected to Biden's Justice 40 effort to target resources to historically underrepresented communities. Is there a New Mexico Justice 40 coalition that is developing Justice 40 proposals? And can you fill us in on who is doing this work in New Mexico and what kinds of proposals are being developed?
Yeah, great question, Paul. I think first and foremost, Justice 40 is really an initiative that's being made in the name of you, in the name of the people. Specifically, if you listening are our frontline indigenous, grassroots, low income, working class communities living near industrial corridors, the folks on the front line and the fence line. Justice 40 is being made in our name and in the name of all of our ancestors who fought and who resisted and worked to continue another way of life. And specifically, it's a response from the federal government, from Biden's administration, on how to address historical legacy harms. First and foremost, this is not the end all be all. This is just the beginning of true reparations. If the federal government continues its sincerity in this way, and hopefully, we're hoping it's sincere and we're behaving in that way to try to work with changing these systems. And so Justice 40 is an administrative restructuring. It changes the way resources are delivered, which means metrics, indicators, right? How are we scoring the value of where we put our investments, our federal money? The important thing about Justice 42 is it's tax dollars. It's everyone who pays taxes and puts money in. And so it's our money, it's the people's money. And that's another important factor. And it's about how do we get more involved in spending our money and where it goes, and in doing real solutions. We know right now big issues, false solutions versus true solutions, and what that means, and how do we know? And I think that's what Justice 40 is about getting those resources, our resources as a people, to the solutions that we know our communities are invested in and are practiced in, especially those ways that are historically, culturally, traditionally practiced, and having large scale legacy investment for that social and ecological transformation that we're wanting. And so it's about everyone. And who has Justice 40 proposals? All grassroots, frontline, fence line communities have Justice 40 proposals. So if you are on the front line right now, the federal government is making investments in the name of our legacy. And so we need to respond. And I think anyone right now know that barriers are being lowered, and that's what we're hearing from the administration. So those on the who have solutions should work with others to gather proposals and look for a large scale investment. We know for a lot of our communities that's not an option, and that's not part of the strategy, and that's respected. And what we are doing with these investments is creating a framework on how to negotiate investments without causing further harm, because that's what we can do.
Okay, well, that was timely because we're going to have to close the radio show, and we'll continue this discussion on YouTube, and it'll be available for our listeners by Saturday morning. And by the time the show airs, it'll be on our website. So can you tell us just quickly, Javier, where people can get more information about the work you're doing?
I think the most important thing to get information about the work I'm doing is first see what's happening in your community, in your backyard, and be connected to that. And for those that are, Los Sardines Institute is a great space to look at where that work is. I'm one of many. And so to really meet everyone in the work, Los Sardines Institute is a great space for the refuge. There's information on the Valle de Oro and the Friends. But I would say No False Solutions. If you haven't heard about that coalition and you're interested in learning more, that's another great space that we're a part of. So that's the work we're supporting, and yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being with us, Javier. We'll continue the discussion in a minute, but until next week, listeners, please stay healthy, happy, and active. It's most important that you stay active right now, because it's the only way. If you're not active, we're never going to fix this mess. So stay active and let's fix it together. We'll be back next week. Thank you very much. Okay, we're back with Javier by the miracle of YouTube. I have to ask you about one project you are researching, if only because on the surface it sounds almost Orwellian. Let's talk about artificial aquifer storage and recovery. What the hell is it, and why on earth does anyone want to do it?
Yeah, so while aquifer recovery and recharging is a millennial old historical, cultural, land-based tradition that looks very different in different places, but there are a lot of similarities. So first of all, recharging our aquifer cognizantly being part of the hydrologic cycle is something we're absolutely have been a part of and has been critical to our being. What you're mentioning, Paul, is really important for us today, because there is something known as artificial aquifer storage and recovery, or also known as subsurface injection, which is where we pump surface water. Basically, the thought is that when we have an abundance, because one of the qualities of aridification and climate change is drought, flood, drought, flood. So the idea is that we have moments when we don't have water, and then we have moments where we have too much water. So in the moments we have too much water, we're going to pump some of that surface water, do our best efforts at cleaning it, and then injecting it hundreds or thousands of feet below the surface of the earth into a area that we've deemed, based on geospatial research and science, that is a good space for putting millions of gallons or billions of gallons of water. What's happening? Well, 25% of all aquifer storage and recovery systems, that's a rough estimate, have ceased or been abandoned, primarily because of clogging. It's a huge issue when you're pumping and when you're putting in and pulling out millions of gallons of water. There's a lot of particles and biologic activity, and so it can clog the ASR system. But the other really concerning part, of course, right, which is really hard to measure and comprehend for us, even with all of our technology, is what are the actual geological, hydrological impacts of forcibly injecting and then pulling that amount of water in the aquifer. Because what we know is, well, one of the concerns, depending on the type of aquifer, because there's many different types, that we can, when you take a lot of water out of the aquifer in a short amount of time, it can cause some of that material in the aquifer to be like a sponge that gets wringed out and it dries up and it shrinks. So then it's not really holding that space. So then you can have collapse of the space above that layer. So there's a lot of scary things that could happen and have happened potentially because of this. And we just don't have enough research to show no harm. So I think the main thing is folks like Albuquerque, we're already doing this. And so we should be active in how we're recharging our aquifers and advocating for more ecological, proactive decisions up front, because it's a major issue and it could have ramifications that would impact the entire aquifer and watershed. So these are huge decisions.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like something we should be messing with too much, although I've been watching the floods in California and the billions of gallons of water that just went pouring into the ocean. I know that they're going to be looking at all kinds of different strategies for capturing that water and putting it in a dam. I mean, it's like in a year, 30% of the water evaporates. So you got to find a solution for storing water when we have this abundance, and New Mexico too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And a lot of that flooding is happening because of the fires, and we know why the fires are happening. So I think these are things that we as a people, at least many of our peoples and our ancestors, have known how to prevent and mitigate. And we need to get back to those ways of doing that.
Okay. Well, speaking of Orwellian, you're also involved in a No False Solutions Coalition with indigenous and frontline communities, organizing against greenwashing and carbon-based mechanisms to capitalize off of climate change. I'm just shocked to hear that there would be greenwashing in New Mexico and that there are corporations seeking to profit on climate change. Can you offer a couple of examples and how you organize against these greenwashing ideas? And in case that didn't convey over the radio, that was sarcasm.
Yeah, well, I think first, lifting up who to hear more of it from, which is, there's some really strong organizers. You interviewed one a few days ago or weeks ago, Paul, which was Seneca from Yucca. So you have the Yucca youth group who's organizing, Pueblo Action Alliance, and a lot of other powerful folks, New Energy Economy, Earth Justice folks in this No False Solutions Coalition. And of course with Los Jardines Institute. And so I think that first that, watching the interviews and looking at these organizations, there's a website with No False Solutions that the coalition has worked hard on. And so that speaks for itself. And so definitely reach out to the No False Solutions Coalition to have direct information and contact for anyone who's interested. A few No False Solutions off the bat: aquifer storage and recovery, deforestation, conventional farming, hydrogen. Those are just a few. I think also false solution is infinite gross domestic GDP growth. Infinite economic growth is a false solution. We know we need to decelerate in first world or industrial countries like the US. And so some of us need to turn it down while other parts of the world actually do turn it up and build the infrastructure they need. But those are some of the false solutions that you can find at No False Solutions online.
Oh, your talk about slow or no growth is music to my ears. One of the trends we see in arguments advanced by the gas and oil and hydrogen advocates is jobs, 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 and far less focused on hydrogen, coal, and gas and oil, or anything that creates jobs. Ipso facto is good. How do you counter those arguments?
Yeah, I think, well, I think the thing about No False Solutions, right, and what we're saying is that, and what's so powerful, especially in relationship to jobs, is that a false solution is something that hasn't proven the precautionary principles, right? We've been across this bridge before. We've walked this road before. This message has been around for a long time around proper development and really what it takes to create a healthy and wealthy world, planetary health and wealth. And I think that a false solution is something that doesn't prove that it won't cause harm. It doesn't have proof or evidence that it'll work. And I think that the jobs in the oil and gas argument is a great case in point. Absolutely, there are a lot of us whose lives depend on oil and gas, and it's a transition that we know is going to happen. It's really about how it's going to happen. And absolutely, we should be, and I think it is being asked for with just transition and other work that's being done nationally, is that those workers are being prioritized for this transition. And so we know that, yes, there's those who are going to get their jobs implicated, and they should be on the front line of receiving the proper training or transition, compensated, all of that, right? To move into the just transition. And so we know that can happen. We know we have the infrastructure and the ability to get our workforce trained and adapted we need to do that. And so it's possible. And there are lots of jobs in the transition. Just to put an economic value of it, the sustainability goals were estimated at $12 trillion of market value. So we know that capitalism and predatory corporations are aiming at using that and most often centralizing that growth in wealth for just a few shareholders. And so we know there's the resources out there to get our people trained, to get adequate pay for jobs. We have the resources. It's really about making it happen. But the plan is there, and we need to communicate to workers that there's a plan to get them trained and involved in the just transition.
So we're sort of bouncing around from topic to topic, but then in reading about you, you seem to have been involved or are involved in a wide range of issues. Is there a unifying social political framework that drives you?
A unifying, what do you mean by that? So can you say more about what for you
is there a philosophy or a social perspective that you can name that like a philosophy or an approach to life or an approach to policy that is kind of an organizing principle for you?
Well, I think if I was to keep it very simple for myself, I think of Octavia Butler and a quote she has, which is, "Everything you touch, you change, and everything you change changes you." And so I would say that's the basis. I understand that everything I do implicates me and the world around me. And I try to learn with that at the center of being part of the larger whole. I think socio-politically, I think the work we're talking about and what we've said thus far pretty elaborates that, but I'm interested in as direct of a democracy as possible. That's for sure.
Okay. All right. And thank you for mentioning Octavia Butler. We just finished reading her book, Kindred, and it's part of our book club that we're going to be discussing on Sunday night. So I'm very excited about that.
Awesome.
Right. High recommendation to our listeners, Kindred by Octavia Butler. Great book. Let's see. One of Retake's, maybe this discussion I thought was maybe where you were going to be headed in terms of an organizing principle. One of Retake's abiding theories is that until we exit capitalism, we will never effectively address the myriad environmental and economic crises we face today and will face tomorrow. Is this consistent with your view? And if so, can you amplify on how that understanding drives your work?
Yeah, great question. I think, well, language is very important and language is political.
Oh, we just lost him. Well, listeners, we just lost Javier. I don't know. We're going to pause and then maybe he'll get back here pretty soon. Yes, we're back. We had a little bit of a disruption there as Javier's internet went out or something, or his Zoom dropped, but he's back now. And so we'll finish that question, basically asking him whether or not it's his view that the root cause of most of our problems, and you had mentioned GDP, is capitalism and the thirst for profit and growth. And until we get rid of capitalism and those goals, we're never going to solve the problems that we face. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think, well, GDP, not as a whole is a problem. The problem is it being on a fictional pyramid as the primary value of health and wealth. But I don't want to throw everything out altogether. But I think what I remember coming alive for me when you asked the question the first time was around the exit, and that we need to exit capitalism. And I think that verb is very important for our language, because I think it's, yes, important. We talk about how we want to change. We know that for sure. We want different. But we do want to be specific on where we're going, because we can exit something. We exited serfdom and feudalism in Europe for capitalism. So, and then we exited we entered feudalism and these things after from the commons. We actually had the commons first, right? And so we've exited several social paradigms and entered into others. So I think, yes, absolutely, it's obvious that we are going to have a forced exit, because unfortunately the nature of capitalism is that it eats itself, and it's a cancerous aspect. So it's almost like physically impossible. That's the physics of it. It's just naturally impossible to keep it going. So we will have a shift and a transition. Change is guaranteed. But how and what does that look like, and the why, and all those pieces are really important. But absolutely, things are shifting. The plates are shifting beneath our feet, and in our hearts, and in our minds, and in our economy, and we can be part of changing and shifting those.
I'm interested in how you go about having those kinds of conversations with people, because when I've tried to talk to them about growth and capitalism as being the root cause of our climate problems and our economic problems, a lot of people push back and say, oh, but it was capitalism that got us the quality of life we have now, and the technology and the innovation and the medical advances and so forth. How do you respond to that?
I think that's great points. And I think it shows that there's not one right answer for everything. And there's a lot of vantage points. And it's important to recognize what our vantage point is, because that'll give us insight onto how we understand the world and how it works and why. And so I think what I do is I just don't try to force the way I think upon anybody. I think it's not worth it. Really, what's worth it is trying to have a relationship where we can really change each other. Because since we're constantly changing each other, whether we're having, no matter how we're relating, the relationship equals change. That's a guaranteed sum, biophysically guaranteed, socially and culturally guaranteed. So I think the best thing we can do is try to relate in a way that makes us more of who we want to be. And I think if I do that, I can't speak for everyone, but when I do that, and it's hard, right? Because if someone's saying things that are offensive and saying things that are potentially harmful, then those are moments where we really need to figure out, one, if we're in the right space, where are the conversations and where's the focus of our energy, but also not be so moved by each other all the time. I think we should be moved, but I think we should also try to really sit with each other and not try to force each other into something. As long as we're having a conversation, like that's what the point of negotiation and discussion is about, is to not use force and violence. And so we have to use those tools and we have to practice them. And I think it's something we've been distanced from and discouraged, is to really talk things through, because of how much harm there's been. And that's just where we're at.
So how do you organize those kinds of conversations among people who maybe don't necessarily instinctively agree? Or is that how you would try and create social change over time, is those kinds of conversations?
Yeah, well, social change is saying that we're all going to change, and we're going to have to decide how we will change, hopefully as much as we can. I think it's just being real. It doesn't look pretty. People are hurt. There's crying, there's hurt, there's grief, there's praise, there's pride and culture. There's also anger and even at sometimes stronger emotions like hate and love. And so I think that we're going to feel all of that. We need to be ready for all of those parts of ourselves if we're going to really take this transformation all the way. But but the main thing is that we have to differentiate between conflict and violence. Conflict needs to happen, or we have violence. Violence is the result of not having enough conflict and dealing with the conflict. The conflict turns into violence. And so I think how we do our conflict is critical, and we should start closest to home. And I think that's the most important part, is we should start with the conflicts closest to home.
Okay. So I want to thank you. This has been very interesting, and I hope that we remain in touch. I particularly am interested in coming down to see Las Jardines. I'll get it right one of these days. And maybe even hook up with Mark and Marla at the same time. Do you know them very well?
Yeah, I know Mark and Marla. Yeah, Mark actually just passed me a book about the Rio Grande and really gave me a really new interpretation of and information, really, research around how the the railroad, the westward expansion, what it's done to this river, to our river. That's really the source of life in this valley. And then Marla is very active in work involving cumulative impacts and other pieces in Mountain View there. And so I've had the pleasure of working with Marla on those issues in Mountain View, working at the Valle de Oro.
And what's the name of the book that Mark suggested for you?
It was called Raining in the Rio Grande.
Raining.
And yeah, I would say it's a very, more critical kind of Western understanding of the river and its development, and it's of extreme value, and adds stories that aren't often told, definitely. So it adds a bit much more part of the picture. It's not the whole picture still, but it's definitely a whole nother big part of the picture that I wasn't aware of, and I learned a lot from.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Javier, and thank you for spending this much time and getting back on.
Hey, absolutely. Thank you, Paul, for all you do. And yeah, I'd love to sit down and talk again just over coffee or something.
Yeah. Whenever you're up here, just let us know. Although during the Roundhouse, our days are just like insane,
Okay.
and very unpredictable. I was supposed to be at a hearing this morning, and then we scheduled this, so I couldn't go. But normally,
Oh,
I'm at hearings. Like yesterday, I was at hearings from 8:30 in the morning until 5:30. And so that's usually my day. And if there's no hearing, I'm usually just going around and going to different offices and talking to legislators. So it's a 60-day marathon for sure. All right. Thanks a lot, Javier.
thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.